So we will send this out afterwards so you can refer back to it or forward to others in your organization that you think might be interested in this. And if you have any questions during this presentation, please use the Q&A button or the chat and we'll make sure we get to them. With that, I'd like to introduce you to our host for today, Reg Harnish, CEO of Orbital Fire, and a man that I believe everyone here has had the opportunity to meet. But Reg, welcome, and let's get started.
It's the first time I've been introduced as a man recently, so thank you for that. Let me also address the obvious first question. Yeah, I'm wearing my jacket. We literally just switched from summer to winter mode in the office, and it's still cold in here. So with the important stuff out of the way, good to see everyone. Thank you for being here. This is a topic that for us has really become very common, and even more common than the conversation are the questions that come out of this. I think there's been a lot of misperception about where the SOC report started, why you might want to pursue this, some of the certification, process. And so today I want to go through and talk about what we're seeing. We call it SOC readiness. But what we're seeing in the market, I want to address some of those misperceptions. I want to provide some clarity around the process from going from nothing to a full SOC report, and answer any questions, of course. So, as Dana mentioned, most of you know the man, so I'll skip my introduction here and get into a little more of the background. So probably our fastest growing service over the last 6 to 9 months, what we're seeing is that even though all of our customers are small, all of our small customers have big customers themselves. And so oftentimes they're subject to larger, more rigorous cybersecurity frameworks or other requirements like the SOC. There are others in this category like the ISO 27K. Maybe if you're a manufacturer, you are now facing CMMC certification in the future, and there are others as well. But as it turns out, the SOC report, or the SOC certification, as many refer to it as, has become sort of the de facto standard for organizations looking to assess the risk and really the viability of any of their supply chain partners. Now, like a lot of other things in cybersecurity, it is widely misunderstood, probably misused or abused, or maybe underutilized in some ways. And I think for small organizations like our customers, there's a lot of opportunity here in terms of competitive advantage, because while we see the SOC expectation increasing for smaller organizations, I feel like we're still in the beginning stages of this. I don't have exact numbers, but again, I can tell you that the demand and interest and curiosity around SOC here for our customers and prospects has really been unprecedented over the last 6 to 9 months. Let's start with a little bit of an introduction and some backstory on this. First of all, the acronym stands for System and Organizational Controls. I've probably heard half a dozen different attempts at this. This is the official name for the control, or I'm sorry, the report. It is and was invented by accountants, and the SOC, and I'll talk a little bit about the different types of SOC reports, but the SOC process, the SOC reporting process, was really born out of older certifications and frameworks that were decades year old. You may have heard of like the SSAE 16 and the SSAE 18, the SOX, SOX, all of which were financial-based audits and frameworks for larger enterprise organizations. That actually became sort of the impetus and the seed from which the SOC 2 report actually was born. But it's good to know that it's an auditor report that was developed by accountants. Only accountants can give you a SOC report. And so I'll talk through this process in more detail. But for you, what'll be important to know is that it's going to be you and us partnering on the readiness side, and then an independent third-party auditor, a CPA firm coming in to conduct the audit and deliver a report to you. I'll talk about this again at the end, but this is not a certification, right? So most people will call it a SOC certification, and that's really a misnomer because it's not a certification at all. In fact, it's really just an opinion letter that is developed by your CPA auditor who will partner with us on the SOC reporting process. So again, 3 parties in total, you, us, and then the third-party auditor. Between you and us, and maybe your IT team, all of the readiness that will be required, we can do ourselves. We will not need the CPA firm for that. But I'm going to talk about some advantages of getting them involved early and why that's really worked. And I'll talk about a few of our partners as well, because we can introduce audit partners that trust our work, they know our work. And one of them is specifically specializes in smaller organizations. And so I don't want to jump ahead, I'll get to all of that. But just know that ultimately what you're going for is a SOC report that is an opinion statement, an opinion letter from your CPA auditor. It's not a certification, it's not a stamp. And then where it was born was really back in the early software as a service days, cloud provider days, where a third party was taking custody of lots of businesses' data. And so the SOC 2 report was invented to provide to those customers an opinion and a statement on how viable is this software as a service provider or this cloud provider, because you're trusting them with your infrastructure, your applications, and your data. We needed a way, an approach for essentially understanding just how reliable and viable these third-party organizations were, because they had become such a big part of your company. Now, the needed is in quotes, as I will talk about in more detail. This is a purely voluntary framework and reporting process. Let me come back to that because I think that's going to be important. I want to dig in. So why would you get a SOC report? Well, you may be getting requests from your supply chain partners, your customers, asking for a SOC certification, of course. You can correct them and let them know that it's actually not a certification. But oftentimes, customers, for whatever reason, will ask for your SOC 2 report, even if you're not taking custody and even if you don't have access to their data. Oftentimes, this SOC 2 is kind of a very generic stamp of approval and a checkbox for organizations to show that they are doing third-party risk management, that they're assessing the risk that they inherit from their supply chain partners and suppliers and providers. So you may be getting those requests from prospects and customers, and this report will provide assurances. It does go into depth about your service delivery, your organization, and a whole bunch of other things. It streamlines the due diligence. So oftentimes, again, even though most organizations who request your SOC 2 report have no idea what's in there, they may not even open it. It will or can streamline that due diligence process. So rather than answering a questionnaire that may have 200 questions in it, you can send a prospect your SOC 2 report, and in most cases, they will accept that as suitable or adequate for their third-party risk. So it can make that sales process much cleaner. I mentioned competitive advantage. That's something that we are laser focused on for our customers, because right now, if you are a small business with a SOC 2 report, you have a tremendous advantage over other small competitors like you, because they are not investing in this. They have not gone through this process. Also, really important to know, and I'll dig into this a little bit, the SOC 2 controls are not just cybersecurity controls. So for example, some of the common criteria or the minimum requirements are, do you have job descriptions for every role? Do you have a board and do you capture meeting minutes? Do you have a change management process and artifacts so that you can prove that it's working? So it goes into depth on a lot of areas, not just cybersecurity. And so there's a lot of trust right now. This is not what I would call a vanity certification, so to speak. If you get a SOC 2 report today, it's at least today, it demonstrates that you have done a lot of work and you have got a lot of things in place in terms of business viability. Next would be our customers learn a ton about their own business by going through this. And they can also identify places where, hey, that doesn't make sense. It seems like that's a wasteful process, or we can come up with a better report, or whatever it is. Or we've identified some risk. Like we aren't capturing board meeting minutes. That's a real problem for us. So you're going to learn a lot about your business, and you're going to find some places where there are improvements and opportunities to be a better, more streamlined, more efficient, competitive organization. And then lastly, we, as part of the readiness, and I'm about to get into this, the first step is your gap assessment, which, as anyone who is engaged for our compliance assessment, you know that not only are we assessing compliance with the controls, but we're also, anywhere there's a deficiency, we are conducting a risk assessment on those and helping prioritize each one of those deficiencies by risk, by priority. And so invariably, if this is the first thing that you do from a compliance standpoint, so to speak, if you're a first assessment, you're going to learn some things about your business, and you're also going to identify, or we're going to identify for you, what are some of your top risks? What are the things that we should be working on right now from a cybersecurity standpoint? So there's a whole bunch of good reasons to go through and invest in the SOC 2 report process. So let me dive into a couple of details here, and then I want to talk about the process itself. Now, there are 3 SOC reports: SOC 1, 2, and 3. The SOC 1, not relevant to this conversation. It really is exclusive to your financial processes and very close to, again, if anyone remembers the SSAE 16 or 18, or the SAS 70, all of that stuff was kind of the earlier versions of auditing financial processes. So of course, and your financials will demonstrate certainly some level of business viability and organization. So the SOC 1 is an important report, but it's not really a cybersecurity report, not relevant to this. Where we see most of the work and most of the interest and curiosity in today is in the SOC 2, which is an audit of your service delivery assets. And that would be your people, your process, your technology, any of the supporting artifacts. Your organization chart, in fact, is a control that would be in your SOC 2. Now, there are 2 different types of SOC 2 report, and you've probably heard the term SOC 2 Type 2, which is really the most common. Certainly all of our customers who are going through this right now are doing SOC 2 Type 2s, because the Type 1 is an observation and audit, a point-in-time audit. And so there's no scrutiny given to how are these controls working over a period of time. That's for this Type 2, which is typically a 6-month observation period in which the audit is performed. I have seen, and we have had a customer, a single customer, who was able to justify that a 3-month audit period was only a 3-month was necessary, not a 6-month. But I've also seen observation periods that were as long as 12 months. And it really comes down to how long is it going to take to prove, right? Because this is a report, this is an audit. You're going to have to prove every control is in place. How long will it take us to prove these things? But 6 months is by far the most common. So there's SOC 2 Type 1 and SOC 2 Type 2. And then the last one is a SOC 3, which again, not super relevant, and honestly, in my opinion, my experience, very uncommon. It's basically a public version of your SOC 2. And because the SOC 2 is a prerequisite for the SOC 3, most people don't go and do a SOC 3 because they've got enough information where they can produce their own public-facing report or something that they might share with a prospect in addition to the report itself. So these are the different types of SOC reports that you can engage for. Again, by far the most common is the SOC 2 Type 2. And then there's another aspect of the scope of the SOC 2 report. The first is this. So the security trust principles, actually, let me take a step back. There are 5 trust principles that can be evaluated or audited as part of your SOC 2 report. The security trust principle is mandatory. They refer to it as the common criteria. And I think there's about 23 controls in there. I may have that number wrong, but it's a not insignificant number of controls, again, because some of them are deep and some of them go beyond cybersecurity, but it is required. And essentially, it looks at things like access controls and change management, data security like encryption, as well as your organization. Things like job descriptions and an org chart and your employee recruiting process, or maybe your employee performance evaluation process. So it does a whole bunch of things, but the security trust principle is required, and it is the minimum, meaning you can do a SOC 2 report on using just the security trust principle. In fact, most of our customers, that's where they start. Now, there are 3 additional that will look familiar, right? Everyone who's familiar with cybersecurity, that mostly what we do is provide assurances around the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data. That's why cybersecurity exists. So the CIA triad, so to speak, is something that we live in every day. And almost everything that we do in cybersecurity relates to one or more of these principles. So confidentiality, right? Keeping things secret that should be secret, making sure that there's no unauthorized access, and that there's some governance structure around what is confidential information. What does it look like? Integrity means there hasn't been any unauthorized or unknown changes to that data, that the data is where you left it, that it's in the condition that you left it. So the integrity, like the data is what you say it is. And then availability, of course, is assurances around ensuring that that data is accessible to the people or processes that need it when it's required, and that it's in the place where you left it, so availability. So that's really cybersecurity in a nutshell, but there's one more, privacy. Again, cybersecurity and privacy do fleetingly overlap, but they are indeed very different things. Security supports privacy principles and processes, but they are very different things. Security is about confidentiality, integrity, and availability, but privacy is about assuming that the CIA principles are in place. How am I using this data? Am I allowed to use this? Have I disclosed to my constituents that this is what I'm collecting and this is how I'm using it? Those kinds of things. So again, privacy, security, often misperceptions about how much commonality exists there. They do overlap, but in large part, they are very different practices. So these are the 5 trust principles. The security trust principle is mandatory, and the others are optional. And so as you go through the scoping process with your auditor, and maybe with us, our assistants, as you go through that audit scoping process, this is a question that we're going to want to answer. Our recommendation, just like the SOC 2 Type 2 is probably the most valuable to a small organization, we believe that the security trust principle is enough to get your SOC 2 report to start. And we may introduce others in the future, but our recommendation is always to at least consider starting with just the security trust principle. Okay, let's talk about the process itself. So there are 5 phases to this, and this would be for anyone who is starting from scratch, has not done any prep, may not know anything about the SOC 2 itself, doesn't have an auditor picked out. Maybe you're just working with us, you're a customer of ours or a prospect of ours. This is what it's going to look like. So the first is the justification. A very important step, because a reminder that the SOC report, that is completely voluntary. It's your to your business to say, hey, the return on this SOC 2 or SOC report investment is going to be worth it. And so there's going to be some conversation about, well, what is our scope? And how many of the trust principles do we feel like we need to pursue to make our SOC report valuable? All of that's going to happen in the justification. But at the end of the day, you're going to say, is this worth it to my business? And as you know, and I hope you know, we are big fans of doing the absolute minimum necessary, right? You constantly hear us preaching that you shouldn't be doing anything in cybersecurity unless there's some return on that investment. Well, the same thing goes for the SOC report. You're going to have to figure out, based on how many requests you're getting for it, how much time it would save in the business development and sales process, how much more your customers spend with you because they trust you. Whatever those variables are, you're going to need to figure those out so you can draw a good conclusion about whether or not this makes sense for you. So that's step number one, is justification, deciding, hey, is this thing worth it, right? And you're going to do some basic math to figure this out, and then make a decision for your business. Okay, once you say, yes, we believe that this is going to create competitive advantage, it's going to streamline my sales process, and it's going to result in 10% increase in my top line, whatever that number is. Now we move into scope definition. So one of the first things that we're going to want to do is identify all of the things that are in your service delivery scope. There will be parts of your business that support service delivery, but may not be directly related to it. So it's people, it's process, it's technology. And you're going to make a list of those things, because that's where we're going to draw this logical boundary, because everything in the scope is going to be audited and everything outside the scope is not. So it's going to be really important that we understand whether you do payroll or you host software or you're managing pension funds and you're taking custody or access of someone else's data as a third party. What things, what assets are in that scope? And then, of course, the second part is you're going to decide, what do my constituents, right? So when I went through that justification, the mathematics behind this, what do I feel is necessary for us as a business, or my SOC 2 report, to create credibility and viability and trust and assurances? And in most cases, I think for a small business, the security trust principle is enough. But depending on what your business is, you may consider other things. So these are the two indices that you're going to be thinking about as we define the scope. The next is readiness, right? So this is where the bulk of the work is going to be, and in many ways, the most time-consuming, most energy-intensive area, because particularly if you're starting from scratch, you've got probably a lot of work to do. If you have been a customer of ours for some time and you are already aligned with a very common framework like HIPAA or New York State DFS or NIST 171, and there are others, SEC, if you've already been working with us for a while, you probably have many of the controls in place. Additionally, as I'll show you at the very end here, there's almost nothing from a cybersecurity standpoint that we can't help you do. So no matter what your readiness looks like, we can do most of it for you. So let's just talk about a couple of things. We find that there's a lot of advantage to getting your auditor involved early, right? So once we get through and make some decisions on scope and in the readiness condition that we're in, we want to introduce the auditor for a couple of reasons. One, that relationship is really important. We want them to trust us. They want them to know us. And we want them to understand the business that they will be auditing. Now, we have a couple of audit partners. In every case so far, the auditors that we have introduced have been selected by our customers. But you may already be thinking about a different CPA firm that you work with and trust. That doesn't really matter as long as they are able to conduct the SOC audit. But we want to get them involved early. And what we'll do is a couple of times throughout the readiness process, we're going to invite them to kind of listen in on where we are. Again, so that we create some familiarity, reduce friction, and maybe expedite the audit itself, build a relationship, build trust, so that, again, we're a team. We're all a team working towards the same thing. Now, there has to be some independence with your auditor as well. So we're careful about not crossing any lines in terms of conflicts of interests and ethics and things like that. But having them involved and kind of, observing the process once or twice in the readiness phase, that is important. The second step is we're going to conduct a gap assessment. And for any of you who have been through any of our assessments, it's nearly identical. The controls will be different. So there is some overlap with HIPAA, CMMC, NIST 171, New York State DFS, others. Yes, but our assessment process looks almost identical. So we're going to conduct evaluations, controls evaluations. We're going to ask you for some proof, documents, network diagrams, other reports, things like that to prove what you're saying. We're going to produce findings and recommendations. So very similar. That gap assessment also, because the auditor will be involved at that point, what we can also do is take a smart step and essentially map any weaknesses in your SOC controls to the auditor's audit objectives. And an audit objective is basically something that the auditor has already told us we are absolutely going to audit these controls. We're going to ask for proof. And in some cases, the auditor may not be interested in looking at every single one of the SOC controls. So we want to make sure that we are lining up and prioritizing remediation for any controls that are deficient and will be absolutely audited during the audit. So that's a sort of a second look at the recommendations that come out of your gap assessment or a compliance assessment. And then the third step is we need to remediate. So the goal, of course, is to be 100% ready before we start the audit, because fixing things during the audit period is just going to prolong that process, which can be frustrating and time-consuming and expensive. So we want to get to the starting line absolutely ready to run the race. And again, depending on what your cybersecurity program, any of you can look at your compliance scores that we give you on an annual basis. That will give you a general sense of how close you are likely to be for your SOC report as well. Again, because there's typically significant overlap between the SOC controls and any other framework. Not everything, but it'll give you a good sense of where you are starting. But what we want to do is for the SOC, we want to be at 100%, right? We want to be at 100% readiness before we start the observation and audit process. So the remediation could be a couple of weeks. If all you need is some documentation, okay, we can build all that pretty quickly. But if you're missing big elements like an incident response tabletop or a risk assessment or training and testing for your people or penetration testing, like bigger elements like that, your readiness is likely to take a little bit longer. I'm going to go through what we typically expect here at the end. I'll talk about timing for every one of these phases in a moment. Okay, once we say, hey, we are 100% ready, we believe that every control is in place and, importantly, auditable, meaning we can prove that it's in place, we're ready for the observation and audit. Now, going back to another benefit of getting the auditor involved a little bit early is we can be sort of skating to where the puck's going to be, so to speak, and predicting when we think the audit's going to start, because we want to compress this timeline as much as possible. So audit, we're 100% ready, and the auditor has been involved, so we're all convening on the same dates to get the process started. Real quick clarification. So there's an observation period, so a not to start before and not to end after, but the audit itself can happen anytime in between those dates. Just point of clarification. So what are we going to be doing during the audit period? Well, because we got the auditor involved early, we generally know what controls we're going to need to prove, what artifacts and evidence we're going to need to supply. We're going to be connected to the auditor's verification tool. Usually that's a cloud-based application where we're uploading evidence. We want to avoid just handing them evidence through email, again, to preserve that independence and eliminate any conflicts of interest, those kinds of things. So we're going to be ready for all of that on day one of the audit. So we're going to start working through. The auditor is going to give us evidence requests. And they're going to be very specific about, hey, what is it that we need to provide so that we can prove that we are SOC 2 compliant, like we're ready, and that the opinion is high. So this evidence, again, will go through their third-party application. We're going to check things off as we get through that. In most cases, we can do all of this work for you. So even though there may be 100 requests or maybe even more for evidence, most of the time, 80 to 90% of those requests, we have direct access to because we're your cybersecurity team. So we're the ones that can get that fast. So we're going to provide evidence on your behalf, but through that tool so that there's independence. And then there's going to be some things that are organizational, human resources, finance, physical security, things that we may not have access to or visibility to that you'll need to provide. But even in those cases, we have, again, because we've been so busy with SOC readiness, we have built some templates that go way outside of cybersecurity. So like an employee performance evaluation form, we have a template. We can share that if you don't have that. And there's a whole bunch of other things as well. So we're going to get ready to, we're going to start providing evidence under their observation. And then, of course, there will be cases where auditor looks and says, hey, I see this access control policy, but it's missing X. Go fix that and then resubmit it as evidence. There are going to be some controls where the auditor has the flexibility to say, as long as you fix it during the audit period, we will still accept it. However, there are also going to be controls that need to be in place 100% before the audit. And then there's going to be another class of controls where it may not occur. So for example, if we needed to prove prove that we have an employee termination process, but you're only 10 employees and you don't terminate anyone during that audit period, the auditor has the flexibility of saying, hey, we evaluated all of the artifacts and evidence. It didn't occur, so we can't prove that it works in operation, but we're going to provide a positive opinion on this as well. Again, the earlier we get the auditor involved, the more you'll understand how they're going to process the audit and where audit exceptions may occur, where audit violations may occur, and where we've got some flexibility to fix some things during the audit. But again, you can anticipate that this will be about a 6-month process. Okay, once we have satisfied every one of the audit requests, we can now move into reporting. And this is where you and we pretty much get to take a breather, because this is all audit function. The auditor is going to go do their own peer review internally. They're going to probably sample and reassess and re-audit certain evidence and reports and things like that. And then they're going to provide an opinion. It's going to be a statement. And I'm guessing many of you have seen one, but if not, I think we have a couple of redacted SOC 2 reports that we can share. Just hit us up afterward and ask for those. But the report is going to be a report that you can share. It's going to be your SOC report. And the culmination of all the work that we had done in the 3 to 9 months prior is going to culminate in this report. The process internally, I'm not a CPA and I don't do SOC audits, but we can tell you that generally speaking, it's a quiet period for the auditor. They are doing work by themselves, independently reevaluating, and then writing up their opinion and the report itself. And that's step 5. So we're going to be sitting around waiting. I'll talk about the timing here. Ultimately, they will issue a formal report. And that is the report that you will use anytime you're under scrutiny from a third party about your cybersecurity program or just business viability and quality in general. All right, timing wise, usually this is a 9 to 12 month process end to end. Let me just break these down. First of all, the justification, that's really up to you. You could spend an afternoon, you could spend 3 months figuring out, hey, is this thing worth it? Are we going to do this? So it's a little bit of variable. The scope shouldn't take you more than a month. Keep in mind that there may be some tweaking of the scope. So as the auditor gets involved, starts to inventory the assets that are in your scope as we've defined it, they may say, hey, we think it's missing this, or maybe this isn't really required. So there may be some small adjustments to your scope, but probably shouldn't be big. I've never seen this take longer than a month, because generally speaking, if you're a business that is typically asked for a SOC report, you kind of know what your service delivery infrastructure looks like, your people, process, and technology. Readiness, this is really where the big variable is, because you can either be 92% compliant with the HIPAA security rule or 98% compliant with CMMC or New York State DFS and not have a lot of stuff left to do. So maybe we're talking about a month, 3 months, or you're starting from scratch. You've never been through this. You've never had a risk assessment or done any kind of compliance work. So we're starting from ground zero, in which case you're more likely to see something between the 3 and 6 month. But we can move as quickly as you want to. Keep in mind that most of the things that we would do, those services can be fully operational in a couple of hours, let alone a couple of months. So we can move as fast as you want to. I'll talk a little bit about what those services look like here momentarily. The audit, you can expect 6 months. With only one exception, have I seen less than 6 months or more. It's almost always 6 months for a small business. Because when you think about the work that the auditor has to do and the controls that are in scope, if it's just the security trust principle, and if the inventory of your in-scope assets is pretty well defined, and if you've been with us any level, any amount of time, you've probably built out a healthy, if not robust, cybersecurity program. And so we expect the audit to be no longer or shorter than 6 months. And then the report, it's typically about a month, somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks. And really, I think a lot of it has to do with the auditor's workload. Like, how quickly can we get through this? Because we've got, a dozen other SOC processes going on. So when you add all of this up, it's 12 months. Typically, we say you're not going to get through this in less than 6, and it shouldn't take more than 12 if we're moving quickly and it's important to you. So 6 to 12 months is a very accurate estimate. And for most of the customers that we are going through this with, it is going to be pretty much 9 months on the nose. So right in the average of that time frame. Okay, I got a couple of final thoughts here, again, because there is so much misperception about what this is. And I know I've kind of generalized in a lot of areas. And of course, you can always talk to us about this if you see the SOC in your future. Just a reminder that it's not a certification. I have stopped correcting people because it is so prevalent, and I don't want to sound like that guy. But it is a SOC report. It is an opinion. It is not a certification. You cannot get a stamp. You will get a logo that you can display as long as your SOC report is active and has not expired. So it feels like a certification, but it's not. It's not necessarily a pass-fail like a certification typically is. So just be aware of that. Again, a reminder that it's completely voluntary. No one can force you to do a SOC report. That said, if your best customers and supply chain partners are saying, hey, listen, we need this, or it's going to be harder for us to do business, you may be saying to yourself, well, yeah, it's not mandatory, but I have to do this, right? From a business viability, from a revenue, from a whatever perspective, keeping your best customer. It may be really important for you, but it is, no one can force you to do it. It's unlike, you know, HIPAA compliance, CMMC compliance, NIST 171 compliance. Those things, if you're in the wrong industry, so to speak, you can be forced to do that, or getting excluded from certain things. The SOC report will require annual maintenance, and so you can expect that each year you will re-evaluate your controls, and that there will be an additional observation by your auditor. They're going to really focus on changes. So if there haven't been any changes, that's a fairly quick process. But there's an expiration to your SOC report. Of course, it's not something you just get and have forever. Your business changes every year. And so you're going to need to maintain your SOC report on an annual basis. You may be expected to expand the scope of your SOC. Again, if your business changes, that seems obvious. But in terms of the depth of your SOC 2 report, what we have seen is as these things mature, as more businesses and organizations understand what they are and what they're not, there is likely to be more clear expectations set of you from the people who are asking you for a SOC report. So today, nobody knows what a SOC report is. Everyone thinks it's a cybersecurity certification. And they also just expect that, instead of answering our questionnaire, you can just send us your SOC report and you're good. And that's because nobody really understands this. No one has taken the time to really, really figure out from a third-party risk perspective, what is the SOC and what is it not? And so we got a little bit of a grace period right now because it will be a rubber stamp in some cases. But again, as this matures and as all of us understand it more, there's likely to be more specificity on the scope of your report and specifically the trust principles by which you need to be audited. So if you go from just security to confidentiality, of course, there's going to be more work. There's going to be more controls. The audit period is probably going to be a little bit longer. Just know that that is in everyone's future, most likely. Now, the extra time that you're going to spend on additional trust principles in a couple of years, you're going to end up making up a lot of that work because, again, there's a lot of overlap between the SOC and the HIPAA security rule or New York State DFS minimum requirements. And so as we look to do this, again, because we in our platform, in our compliance assessment process, we have the ability to what we say map controls, which means assessing a control once and applying it multiple times. So for example, encryption is required in virtually every single framework out there. And it's mentioned, it's part of the SOC 2 process as well. So if your SOC 2 encryption control is in place, well, there's a 99% chance, I'm estimating, there's a high percentage likelihood that you will satisfy the same control in the HIPAA security rule for New York State DFS, for NIST 171, for CMMC. So you can see how this starts to add up because the cybersecurity controls do map to one another fairly well in most cases, and there's a lot of overlap. So working with us, we're going to help you figure out how can we minimize the additional work or save some time in the process throughout by doing this double dipping, this mapping of controls in the process. How do we help? We're not an aggressive sales organization, as you've probably figured out. But for those of you who might be interested in more information or actually pursuing this, the first is in the audit readiness. We're going to conduct a gap assessment. We're going to do comprehensive remediation. So virtually all of our 16 services apply to SOC 2. There's probably 3 that do not apply directly. So we can do 13 things for you that satisfy the vast majority, almost all of the cybersecurity controls. We also have templates in areas that aren't cybersecurity. So if you need let's say an employment candidate like screening evaluation, we have a template that we can share, and you can do whatever you want with that. So we can save some time in that. And then also, of course, we're going to help you find an auditor. We have 2 really good partners, and one is local and really specializes in smaller businesses. Almost all of our customers today have selected them, and it's just been a great working relationship. Just minimal audit friction, expediting the process, good people, so we can introduce those partners to you. Again, we'll work with any CPA firm to get you ready. So don't think that you have to use our partners, but they are there, and there are some benefits to that. And then during the audit, again, as I mentioned, when the auditor sends or requests 100 pieces of evidence, there's like an 80 to 90% chance that we are the people closest to that evidence, and we will do all of that work for you. Additionally, if there's reactive remediation, again, I talked about the access control policy needing a few tweaks. If that's the case, and it's something cybersecurity related, we're going to help you, or we're going to do all of the work for you in that case and resubmit on your behalf. So we do a significant percentage of the work. So if you're concerned today that, hey, I'd love a SOC 2, but I don't have the time for it, I promise you that the vast majority of the work we will do for you, or on your behalf, or with you in a way that will minimize any level of effort that you're facing. And just because I mentioned the services here, here are some of the services that are directly relevant to the SOC 2. You can see there's a couple that aren't in the minimum, trust principle, the security trust principle, those minimum requirements. Cloud protection, I would argue, for some customers is actually required, but you can just kind of get a sense of virtually all of our services in one way or another will contribute to or get you credit for SOC readiness and expedite the process of getting to and through your audit. Okay, that's my story, sticking to it. If you have any questions, of course, you can email me, email your customer success specialist. We can set up time to walk through your specific case, because we probably have access to, most of our customers are doing some kind of compliance work with us. And so we're going to already know where you are. So we're going to have a more specific conversation about how long, what's involved for you, how much work, that kind of thing. And of course, answer any questions, and then talk about, potential next steps if this is something that you've been thinking about or are 100% committed to doing at some point. So that's all I have for today. I know some of you end up sending questions over an hour later because it didn't come to you, but we'll open it up right now to see if there's anything that we can answer for you.
All right, any questions? Well, as Reg said, for sure, always send them to either Reg or to your customer success specialist, and we're always here for you. We'll also be sending out the recording if you want to review this later. So with that, Reg, I just do want to mention to everybody that at the beginning of December, we're going to have our next customer exclusive webinar, Mind the Gaps, 7 vulnerability management tips for small businesses. So look forward to getting a message about that, so you can sign up. And I hope everybody has a fantastic day. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for your time, everyone. Great to see you.
Yes.